Now we will see the hypocampectomy in the removal of the temporal lobe for a mesial epilepsy. So the hypocampectomy has 4 steps. The first one is the opening of the choroidal fissure, and second through 4 is just disconnection. So we have disconnection, anterior disconnection, medial disconnection, and posterior disconnection. So in the opening of the choroidal fissure, we incise through the tinea fimbria. This tinea fimbria is the thing that is attaching the choroidal plexus to the fornix. So we incise the tinea fimbria and we divide the choroidal fissure into a anterior portion and a posterior portion. How are we going to find the choroidal fissure after we incise the tinea fimbria? We look for the choroidal plexus at the temporal horn, usually medial to the temporal horn. We follow it and we find the choroidal fissure. The choroidal fissure marks the beginning of the hippocampal body, and a little bit more posteriorly also the beginning of the tail of the hippocampus. The head of the hippocampus is just anterior to the inferior choroidal point. So now we have an anterior segment and posterior segment of the opened choroidal fissure. On the anterior segment or portion, we will see the posterior cerebral artery, and in the posterior segment we will see neural structures that are below the hippocampus, for example the parahippocampus. Then after the choroidal fissure is opened, we usually find a prominence, intraventricular prominence, that is the one that is our landmark for finding the pulvinar of the thalamus. Then we continue with the anterior disconnection. The anterior disconnection is mainly the disconnection of the hippocampal head from the surrounding structures, mainly the uncus rectus. So we need to disconnect the hippocampal head from the uncus, the uncal rectus, and the medial wall of the temporal horn of the ventricle, of the lateral ventricle. Temporal horn. The medial wall of the temporal horn at the, or just anterior to the inferior choroidal point, is the hippocampal head itself. After this, we're going to follow the uncal rectus and the hippocampal head. Medially, we follow them and we reach the vertex of the uncus and the posterior segment of the uncus. Remember that the posterior segment has 2 surfaces, the inferior and the posterior medial. Then we expose a arachnoid membrane that is just medial to these structures, and then we can visualize the posterior cerebral artery. It is usually the P2A segment of the posterior cerebral artery and the oculomotor nerve. This is very important because when we can visualize these structures, it means that the inferior portion of the posterior medial surface of the posterior segment and the inferior portion of the vertex have been removed. Both the superior portions of the uncal parts continue to be not removed. Then the anterior dissection continues. The anterior disconnection continues laterally to the collateral eminence, and then continues medially and posteriorly until we reach again the choroidal fissure. Then we pass to the medial disconnection. The medial disconnection is mainly the disconnection of the mesial structures from the content of the crural and ambient systems. So in the medial disconnection, we begin in the opened choroidal fissure. Here we have two arachnoid membranes. One is in the ambient system and the other is perpendicular to that membrane of the ambient system. They both carry the hippocampal vessels, arteries, and veins. These hippocampal vessels enter the temporal lobe through the hippocampal notch just below the head of the hippocampus, and the blood vessels that are on the membrane that is in the ambient system are perpendicular to those vessels that are on the ambient system. The first arachnoid membrane, the one that is in the ambient system, separates the parahippocampal gyrus from the inferior surface of the posterior segment of the uncus. And these hippocampal vessels need to be disconnected from the head of the hippocampus. These vessels are in the first arachnoid membrane, the one that is in the ambient system, and these same vessels that are now on the perpendicular arachnoid membrane, the other membrane, need to be disconnected from the body of the hippocampus. After the medial disconnection, we pass to the posterior disconnection. That this is followed in the choroidal fissure, lateral to the choroidal fissure. Here we can reach either the floor of the middle fossa or the tentorium, depending on the extension of the removal of the hippocampus. If the whole hippocampus is going to be removed, we need to find a very important landmark called the calcar abyss. The calcar abyss is a prominence in the medial wall of the ventricular atrium, and then the disconnection follows all the choroidal fissure, and after the removal of the anterior and medial cortex and the structures, the medial structures, including the hippocampus, parahippocampal gyrus, and fornix, the content of the ambient system is exposed. This content includes the posterior cerebral artery, the basal vein of Rosenthal, crus cerebri, the tegmentum of the mesencephalum, and sometimes the trochlear nerve and the superior cerebellar artery. And when we open the choroidal fissure, all the structures that are lateral to the fissure can be removed, and all the structures that are medial need to be conserved. The choroidal plexus that is attached to the thalamus will be preserved. In the medial disconnection, we have the anterior choroidal artery, that is a branch of the internal carotid artery, and the posterior lateral choroidal arteries that are branches of the posterior cerebral artery. Those arteries and the intraventricular vein are conserved because they are still in the medial part of the choroidal fissure. So in the hypocampectomy, in a mesial lobe epilepsy, we first open the choroidal fissure, incising in the tinea fimbria. We have an anterior and posterior portion. In the anterior portion we see the posterior cerebral artery. In the posterior portion we see the parahippocampus gyrus. The choroidal fissure is reached by following the choroidal plexus in the temporal horn, and the choroidal fissure will mark the beginning of the hippocampal body, and a little bit more posteriorly the tail of the hippocampus. Then we have the anterior disconnection, that is the disconnection of the head of the hippocampus from the uncal recess and the medial wall of the temporal horn. We follow the uncal recess and the hippocampal head. We reach the vertex and posterior segment of the uncus, respectively. Then we expose the membrane, arachnoid membrane, that is just medial to those structures. And when we see the posterior cerebral artery, the P2A segment, and the oculomotor nerve, we know that the inferior portions of the vertex and of the posterior medial surface of the posterior segment of the uncus have been removed, not the superior portions. And we continue the disconnection laterally to the collateral eminence and superior, posterior, and medially until we reach again the choroidal fissure. We continue with the medial disconnection, that is just the removal of the disconnection of the hippocampal vessels from the head and the body of the hippocampus. And in the posterior disconnection, we follow the choroidal fissure until the floor of the medial fossa or the tentorium. We localize the calcar abyss and we expose the content of the ambient cistern.